Hi everyone, welcome back. It's Evan, and in this lecture we're going to be talking about the relationship between obesity and disease risk. So if we look over here in this table, we can see that we have a number of different conditions that are related to having higher body fat percentage and obesity overall. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, coronary heart disease, all of this entire list all the way down to things that we don't necessarily think about, like psychological conditions of depression, also general physical pain, and at the bottom here, a really important one, we see a relationship between obesity and all-cause mortality. And although it's important to discuss just the general relationship, we want to think about why, because we need to get into how the obesity will relate to some of these. So let's take an example of type 2 diabetes for right here. So if we think about type 2 diabetes, we have to work backwards a little bit. So what is type 2 diabetes? Well, it's the inability to adequately remove, I'm going to just put BG for blood glucose. And then if we think all the way at the bottom of our list, what is obesity? It's going to be increased body fat mass and/or percentage. So how can we connect the gap between these two things? Well, if we work backwards from our inability to remove our blood glucose, this happens by two different mechanisms with diabetes. We have number one, which would be decreased beta cell insulin production. So, in response to higher blood glucose levels, our beta cells of our pancreas are not going to secrete as much insulin as they normally would. Number two, we would also have decreased insulin sensitivity. So our peripheral cells in our skeletal muscle are going to respond less to the insulin that is being produced. Therefore, you're going to get less translocation of your GLUT4 transporters, which we'll get into later, and therefore less removal of blood glucose from your bloodstream. So these two factors play into here. Well, if we think about obesity and body fat, we need to consider fat as an excretory organ. And generally, we don't think of fat as being something similar to the pancreas in and of itself. But we know that fat is going to secrete different signaling molecules. Of these, the four which are most closely related to our diabetes are going to be just free fatty acids. Circulating free fatty acids send a message to the body. Also, we have adiponectin, we have another messenger called plasminogen activator 1, and also our exomes, part of our genetic material. Now, it's not necessarily as important to understand exactly what each one of these ones does, but a really important part is if we think about just free fatty acids, we know that free fatty acids contribute to both of this dysregulation. We have free fatty acids independently reducing our pancreas's beta cells' ability to produce insulin and the ability of our peripheral cells to be sensitive to that insulin. So what we've shown here is one of the increased risks of type 2 diabetes with obesity. Here is the pathway of how it happens. So it's not just the fact that you have increased body fat that would going to increase your risk for diabetes. It's the downstream effects of what that fat actually does. However, we have to think about one other portion of this. Because this is an exercise physiology class, we need to talk about physical activity. And Stephen Blair has done fantastic work over the last 20 or 30 years in the relationship between physical activity and your fitness level and your risk. And what they've been able to show is that physical activity, PA, is protective. Meaning that if you are a person with increased body fat mass, but you're also physically active, that's going to help protect against some of these mechanisms right here. So a person who is classified as obese but is physically active is going to have a lower risk for any of these sorts of disorders compared to a person who is obese and is not physically active. So we need to take a look at the whole picture. It's not just the obesity that is causing these diseases, but it's also some of the behavioral concepts as well. So stay tuned for the rest of the lectures where we'll get into some more